Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology and for a session with the Undersecretary of the Bureau of Industry and Security, Alan Estevez. My name is Kevin Wolf. I'm a senior fellow here with CSET. And I'm just going to do a brief setup and then turn it over to the Undersecretary and then Hanna Dohmen for discussion thereafter before questions. So to set the stage, export controls, regardless of the decade, regardless of the country, all boil down to really one sentence. There are the rules that govern the export, re-export, and transfer of commodities, software, technology, and occasionally services, activities, to specific end uses, end users, and destinations to achieve national security and foreign policy objectives. So that's my entire 30-year career in one sentence. All of these very complex regulations that exist that are administered by states and commerce in particular and around the world, really it all boils down to that one sentence. But then the key question is, what does national security mean? And that is a concept that has evolved over the decades. If you look at the national security objectives for export controls, for example, during the Cold War, it was a containment policy against the Soviet Union and the East Bloc and had broader strategic objectives to it beyond the nature or characteristics of any particular items. And then when I started practicing and doing export controls, really about 31 years ago, was right at the end of the Cold War, where the concept and the purpose and the national security objectives of export controls really began a really radical transformation. And I see Bill Reinsch here, who had lived through this then when he was undersecretary at the Bureau. And essentially what things evolved into was far more of a focus on using export controls as a tool of non-proliferation and channeled through 4 multilateral export control arrangements focused on controlling and identifying the items that were weapons of mass destruction, conventional weapons, and then the parts, components, and software that had some sort of identifiable direct relationship to their development, production, or use. And then the way in which this system would be implemented is that the allies would come together every year and they would implement in their own domestic regulations the items that by consensus with a common national security and non-proliferation focused objective, the allies would agree to. And that sort of classical approach to export controls that didn't take into account broader strategic issues or didn't take into account economic implications of the controls, really was sort of the classical structure in the 90s and the aughts, and then when I started at the Commerce Department. And then what really began to evolve, particularly with respect to China, is really a questioning about whether that sort of classical approach to export controls could be successful with respect to an evolving national security threat involving emerging and foundational technologies and a structure of a country that deliberately targeted commercial items in order to modernize its military. And then this led to a very active, very bipartisan, very robust public discussion with Congress over the end of 2017 and first part of 2018, and new authorities for the Bureau that led to, in August of 2018, the Export Control Reform Act. And so I believe now that we are at sort of a foundational inflection point as to the role and purpose of export controls. And
I do have a number of CSETers currently working in the Bureau, or as I call them, B-setters. As Emily knows, it's true. So this is a great opportunity for me to overview what we're doing. So when we look today at the way we are using export controls, or the way the Commerce Department is thinking about the national security perspective, and commerce is in the middle of national security in a number of spheres these days. Frankly, the job I'm sitting in, I never expected to be sitting in the NSC as much as I am. More than I want to tell you the truth, because when you're over there, you're not in the office doing your job. But there's a reason that Gina Raimondo was just out at the Reagan Forum, the premier National Security Day event around the country these days, because commerce is in the middle of the national security sector today. And we do it from 2 perspectives. We do it from offense and we do it from defense. Offense is things like CHIPS Act. So how are we going to build chip production in the United States where we have assured supply of semiconductors, the foundation of a lot of what goes on in our economy? And again, I said assured supply, not sufficient supply, because we're still going to rely on the global commons for providing semiconductors. That includes potentially adversarial nations, though we're trying to wean ourselves away from there. And it's not just semiconductors, it's working through things like the TTC, our work with Europeans, or IPAF, our work with our Asian allies around things like rare earths and supply chain issues. Because again, you run out of rare earths, and especially as we prompt China to retaliate for certain things, it can lead to a bad end, right? So we need to shore up our supply chains. And if that didn't become apparent during COVID, when there was many supply chain disruptions because of pandemic, not because of kinetic action in the Pacific, there's lots of other things that could happen. So if COVID didn't wake you up, Putin's invasion of Ukraine should have woken you up to unreliance on single source supply. So we need to have diverse supply. And those are the things that we're working on in the Department of Commerce. And we stood up a large supply chain team under the International Trade Administration led by Grant Harris, the Assistant Secretary there. So that's on the offense side. Defense side, that's kind of my writ. And so the core of those defense structure is our export controls, protecting the technology that our adversaries could use against us should it ever come to any kind of kinetic action. And frankly, the way I look at it, and I put my little DoD hat on, these are shaping actions, right? The Chinese have a sovereign nation, they can modernize their military, right? There's nothing that the United States can really say to prevent that. So they can modernize their military, they just can't do it with our stuff or our allied stuff. And that's the goal that we're trying to achieve on our export controls. So let me dive in a little bit there in a moment, but I also want to talk about Russia. Right? So before Putin invaded Ukraine, but when we could see that that was a most likely outcome as he coiled his force on the border, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Export Administration, he used to work for Kevin, took off and went to Brussels and negotiated with 38 other nations and built a coalition of nations that were willing to put strong controls on Russia, even to the detriment, for the Europeans, the intertwinement of their economy and the Russian economy was much stronger than it was with ours. Right? But so they put those controls on, and those controls over time, the analogy I like to use is an anaconda. It's going to slowly squeeze the life out of the Russian industrial base. Probably not fast enough for the Ukrainians, who we just had a big conference on speaking about offense in the Department of Commerce yesterday in conjunction with our defense allies to help build Ukrainian defense industrial capacity. And having sat in the opener there and then walked through the lobby and looked at the companies that were there, it's real American defense companies and European defense companies who are looking to help Ukraine in the Department of Commerce lobby, and then listening through a number of sessions yesterday. Fantastic to see. So we're slowly going to squeeze the life out of the Russian defense industrial base. I'll know I'm successful when they're throwing rocks on the front line there. Unfortunately, that was a tactic that Wagner uses anyway, so can't tell whether you're successful that way. But we're going to do that, and we're going to be successful as we stand by Ukraine. For China, and Kevin talked about the way the regimes work, we're taking a much more aggressive approach. Well, I'm saying defense. The analogy there, and I'm dating myself because I'm old, but when I think about the way Lawrence Taylor changed the way defense was played from a linebacker position in football, he was an offensive force on the battlefield as a defense, on the football field as a defensive player. That's what we are doing. So when we do sector bans, rather than pinprick over this company on the entity list or this piece of cargo to this company on the entity list, when we do sector bans like what we did with chips last October 7th and what we updated on October 17th, we are denying the Chinese the highest end of the capability that they need to develop artificial intelligence. So, it's a small segment of chips and the tools that make those chips, by the way, so they can't replicate that. And yes, I know they have a stockpile of chips, of tools, but over time, these things will have greater and greater impact. And that's where the offense side comes in, of course, because you have to run faster while you're putting up these hurdles for them. I mean, they're smart people, they're going to indigenize, but we're going to slow that down, impose cost, and impose time with those costs as we do this. So those sector bans stop them from getting the most advanced chips. Again, we updated the rules this past October around that work. And why do I care about Chinese development of artificial intelligence? When I talk about artificial intelligence, I'm talking about more like the generative AI level of above ChatGPT-4, not Hello Siri, right? And the example I just used talking to people, it's the Air Force has a program called Collaborative Combat Aircraft, unmanned airplanes flying with F-16s that will run interference for the F-16, can carry ordnance, can carry electronic warfare capability, and can act independently of the pilot. So they do need a man in the loop for ordnance release. That man in the loop can be the pilot who's flying with them. Pre-programmed, just like a HARM missile, it fires and then it finds its target. It's already acting artificially intelligent. That's what we're trying to do with our military. Well, that's what the Chinese are trying to do with their military too. And that's for a piece of equipment. When you start talking about command and control and targeting capability and logistics, my old fear in the Department of Defense. Seconds mean something in combat. Ability to get supply in the right place means something, especially in a contested environment. Outrunning your supply line can lead to a bad end for an army on the move. And he who figures it out quicker is going to have advantage on the battlefield. And we never want US or allied forces to be at a disadvantage on the battlefield. So that's why what we're doing, I don't want them to do it. If they're going to do it, and they will do it, I don't want them to do it with our stuff. So that's the way we are playing export control to the Department of Commerce right now. And so let me end right there, and we'll jump into questions. I do have one more thing to say. Go sit in your seat. I just want to point out, and Secretary Raimondo made this point at Reagan the other day at the Reagan Forum. My budget for the BIS has been flat since 2010, essentially flat, index for inflation. There's you can all see a little bump up for a new program that I inherited called Information and Communication Technology Services. That is a new program that's not managing export controls. So flat budget, licenses have, what's it, doubled, tripled? Pretty much doubled license applications, and the complexity of our rules has doubled. So, the average weight of a rule is 65% more than it was 10 years ago. And if you want to be an export control lawyer in this room, we're giving you a lot to chew on when we put out rules these days. Very complex, because we're trying to be targeted and we're trying to be meaningful in what we're doing. So we're working, as Secretary Raimondo said the other day, my budget's about $200 million, pocket change in my defense days, pocket change even for AT&L in my defense days. And she said, give me about 2 fighters worth of additional resources and I can be really impactful on the battlefield. That's about another 200 million for those of you who don't want to calculate that off the top of your head. So we're looking at what we really need to be even more effective in the environment that we're operating in.
Thank you so much. That was all very insightful. So I think, yeah, we'll just dive right in with some questions and discussion. So you already talked about, the most recent controls, the October 17th controls, which are an update to the October 7th controls last year on advanced computing items, chips, supercomputing, manufacturing equipment to China. And of course, those controls have been expanded both in terms of the chips that are controlled, as well as the SME, the equipment that's controlled, and also to which countries those items are all. So I'm curious if you could, you already talked a little bit about how this all plays into slowing China's military modernization. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the objective of the controls and how that has evolved since October 7th, or even before that of last year.
Yeah, oops. Seems a little loud. There we go. Yeah, the controls, yeah, the objectives haven't changed, right? They're still aimed at national security purposes around Chinese military modernization. And we do recognize that there's economic impact on these controls. China does have something called civil military fusion strategy. So it's very hard to say that if I let them have advanced manufacturing equipment, that the stuff made with that won't go to the Chinese military. If I let advanced chips go, it's hard to say that even going to, a potential commercial company, Tencent, ByteDance, name the company, that it won't be used for Chinese military capability. So I'm sorry, there's impact in the economy, but that's not the goal. So the goal remains the same, to impede Chinese military modernization. I think we need to be realistic that it is not stop. Stop is pretty much an impossibility, right? China has an economy that's not doing so great right now, but they do have, they're willing to spend a lot of money in this space, even at the impact of other things that might be better for their own economy, frankly. So they're willing to spend a lot of money on this to build that capacity. They're throwing money at it. That doesn't always lead to an outcome of a resource, a new tool, that indigenous tool. It's very hard. It took 30 plus years to build the EUV machine that ASML makes. So it's not going to be an overnight capability, but eventually they'll get there. Obviously, we just saw they used a DUV machine and some other machines to make a 7-nanometer chip. That's an interesting thing. That the yields, as far as we know, are pretty low on that. But the yields don't have to be huge for military capability. So it's and there's CPUs, not GPUs, that we're talking about, but they'll get there too, right? So all we're doing is putting up impact time. So it's time and it's money. It's going to cost them more, and it's going to take them longer to achieve the same outcome that we could achieve with the equipment and the capability we have. Now, it behooves the United States and its allies to take advantage of that gap, right? So it takes our Defense Department to build programs and infuse the innovation that's coming out of the private sector into those programs. I was up at Stanford right before I was at the Reagan Forum, a whole dialogue about that with some innovative companies. A few former DIU directors sitting at the table.
So, you talked about, it's quite interesting. You brought up the gap, right, between the capabilities that U.S. companies have or allied companies and the capabilities that Chinese companies have. And of course, you mentioned that it takes time. So I'm curious, how do you look at the effectiveness of controls, both in the immediate term as well as in the long term, right? I think, based on that gap and the fact that it does take time, I think effectiveness probably looks different in the immediate term.
Yeah, and I haven't talked a whole lot about the enforcement side of this, right? There's an enforcement component of this too. And we're always looking for ways to shut down diversion routes. I can talk about that in spades of what we're doing in the Russia scenario. So two ways we assess where the Chinese are, right? One, we rely on the full gamut of American government capability, including our intelligence capacity to do that. Mixed results, quite frankly, but they're working at the strengthening that capability there. The other way I go is I talk to the companies who are operating in China. And I get lots of feedback, including from the companies that I'm regulating, right? Who are saying, hey, if you put a control on this chip, there's already a Chinese chip that's of a similar capability. So you're really not going to achieve your end. And then we'll go out and do whatever research we can around that chip to see whether that, in fact, is the case. So in their own self-interest, they're passing that information, or because they're patriots. I don't care why, they pass the information. And I appreciate it. And I'll, give them credit for doing that. And, same thing for tool makers, same thing for people in other sectors that are feeding us information. And so we make an assessment of where we are, and then and sometimes we get surprised, but for the most part, I think that's holding up. I don't want to get swung around like the phone or something like that, but it's a phone with a chip that's not as good as the chip that was in the phone made by them in 2019. Let's go there. I consider that a 4-year success.
Right, sure, yeah. So, I think you kind of already hinted at this a little bit. And the most recent controls, of course, extended or increased the number of chips that are now fall within the technical parameters, right, identified by the Bureau of Industry and Security. And, to what you just described, of course, it makes a lot of sense to control those chips that have those capabilities of training frontier AI models and military applications, of course. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the rationale of also extending the controls to chips that are generally used for more, gaming applications and normal data center or standard data center applications. I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about the rationale and of course, the companies have to comply with that.
Sure. And, look, again, I talk to these companies all the time. No company wants to be told, like, I'm going to shave revenue from them. Most of them understand the rationale of why we're doing it. Most of them, they'll comply for sure, right? No one's going to go out. These are all really good American or allied companies. They're all going to comply. They might not be happy, at least in the near term, to mimic the Secretary Reagan. She said something to the effect of rule of law and a democracy is important, more important than short-term revenue gain. And it's good for companies too over the long term, which I also support and believe. So when we looked and decided like what chips get covered, we spent a lot of time working with the companies, learning what their plans were, learning what the dynamic of this chip versus that chip was. I learned more about chips in the last year than I ever wanted to. And I used to do chip stuff at the Department of Defense. So it's not like I came blind. I talked to the AI companies about why would you use this chip versus this chip. We also said, could you use this chip? And then we went to some independent validators, both inside government labs, and we went to smart, I won't call them out, like really good company, FFRDC types of smart capability in there, and said, could you take this chip and string it together? And how, could you do that with this chip? This gaming chip, for example. And the answer is yes. It might take, with an error ratio that's much higher for a large language training model, and you might have imposed costs of 2 to 11 times, depending on the chip. And we decided, okay, is 2 times worth it? It's 5 times worth it. Do we want to be conservative? And this was an interagency process. We made recommendations. Then, the final decisions of this was the National Security Council level decision. We had a strong role to say there. So the answer is, yeah, you could string a whole bunch of these chips. And there's some other chips that really aren't really good for AI, but they're really good for supercomputers or for modeling. And yes, they could be used in a banking system as well, but they're really good for supercomputers and nuclear modeling and hypersonic weapon modeling and other things like that. And what we try to do for those type of chips is we put them in, the gray zone on the October 17th rules. So we can see for this sale, for this chip, yes or no, or yeah, okay, that chip's good. you're good. Don't have to bother coming in for a license.
Thank you. Yeah. So you just in your response, you also talked about, Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo just over the weekend talking about democracy also being good for companies. And in that discussion, in that talk, she also, of course, said that companies must follow the rule of law as well as the spirit of the law. I'm curious if you could maybe just, if you'd like to add anything to that, or maybe talk about the expectation in terms of companies following the spirit of the law.
All right, it's Christmas time. We should all be in the spirit.
That is fair.
And one of the spirits that we, when I have the ghost of Christmas future take me on my journey, what I don't want to see is us all following a PRC model on that journey. So, the secretary did not call out any particular company, and she didn't mean to call out any particular company. What she said is that we're going to protect national security. Right? Companies are going to do what companies do. Companies are in the business of making profit for them and their shareholders. That's what drives the innovation in the American system. It's a good system. We support that system when I want that innovation. That innovation is key, not just to run faster for defense means. It's key for the underpinning of the American economy and the economy of our allies, and we want that. So we encourage companies to go out being innovative. We encourage companies to comply. We set a standard if they happen to do something around that standard. What we really want them to do is come in and talk to us before they do that, and we can give them some advice around that. But if a company does something that we think would run afoul of our national security concerns, we'll talk to the company, and if we need to put control on, we will.
Makes sense. So maybe to shift gears a little bit, of course, you've already mentioned working with allies is hugely important for the effectiveness of export controls. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, how we of course know that over the last year and also before that, in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and also on bringing the Japanese and the Dutch on board to control semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how that work with allies, partners has looked both on, and will look in the future, both in terms of setting export control policy as well as enforcement.
So, let me use the Russia model real quick, and I'll talk about some of the work we're doing with relation to PRC. Russia was an immediate circumstance, combat in Europe, not a good thing. Threat to the international order by Putin, not a good thing. If you want to say good things about Putin, poster child for NATO membership. 2, strengthening NATO overall, even without new members. And 3, bringing together a coalition to see what autocrats can do that's not even in their own self-interest, to tell you the truth. Right? So easy bring together of countries to put controls on Russia. And, varying degrees on success in different countries. They have different legal parameters in the way they work. And I speak to all these countries all the time with relationship to enforcement of those controls. I think we just did an entity listing yesterday, 42 companies, including a guy that's in handcuffs in Belgium right now for evading those controls. And we've worked with our European allies, especially, and their sanctions czar and the British, to visit countries in Central Asia, where we see companies that didn't exist until March 2022 that are now on the receiving end of weird trade, like, 12,000% increase in laptops going to Armenia, where there hasn't been a 12,000% increase in population. And again, they're going to companies that didn't exist, right? So we're going to those countries. I've met with the ministers of all these countries. We've sent teams out with Treasury as well. So Liz Rosenberg, Brian Nelson, out in the world. And, for like countries like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, I note to them when I meet with them that they live in a very tough neighborhood. And that, a state on their border seems to think that any state that had SSR on the end of it belongs to them. And so you got to recognize that. But we also tell them, here's the problem, you take care of it, or we will. And for the most part, they'll work with us. And so it's whack-a-mole. You got to keep on it. For the greater discussion with allies, with China, with relationship to China, you know, we are allies, and we share the same values. We understand the same threats. We built the international order together in the post-World War II world. We believe that order works for us, and frankly, for the greater good of the world. We believe we all have vested interest in keeping it. So you start there in the dialogue, and then you can start saying, we need to do this. And for the most part, you know, it might take a little time. Persistence has its own value, as I said downstairs. But they come on board. And so I'm very bullish on our ability to bring our allies along on things that.
Excuse me. Maybe, sorry, lost my voice.
I know you tear up when you hear how easy it is to work with
wonderful.
allies.
Gosh, wow. It's world order. Sorry. So, excuse me. So over time, is your sense, you know, just to follow up on that, do you get the sense that, you know, through, especially with Russia, that coordination is now getting easier, or are there aspects that are also becoming more difficult?
Well, I'm on the more difficult side is we're sort of out of slits on like what else we can do. You know, we can go full embargo. Our goal has never been to like harm the Russian people per se, to harm the regime, and the industrial base that's supporting the military capability of that regime. You know, so like stopping medicines from going, you know, has its own negative effect in a sense. But from a perspective of talking to allies, easier, like, you know, we're all in sync these days on that. But, you know, China's a harder question, right? It's a hard question for us too. The economies are intertwined. Where do you make the most impact? And what's the negative consequence of that impact? And sometimes that trade space, you know, impacts your national security too. Not like we would trade for you know, this company or that company, we would never compromise national security. But what constitutes, to Kevin's point, what's in the best national security interest might not be the point to poke this one versus that one. And so finding that right balance makes the job fun and hard, and fun and hard.
Definitely.
And the same thing applies in talking to our allies about that. So why'd you think about this versus that?
That makes sense. So thinking maybe, excuse me, ahead a little bit, how is BIS thinking about what other technologies should be, you know, on your radar? What, you know, how do you identify what other future technologies in a space that is developing so quickly, both in terms of the national security and geopolitical environment, as well as the you know, involvement of emerging technologies?
Sure. Couple of things there. One, I am working to beef up technological capability, both internal and external to BIS. You know, I'd like to have like the DARPA model at BIS. It would be hard to do that because, you know, DARPA has separate hiring authorities, and people in DARPA, you know, roll in and out of government, right? They come in from whatever lab that they're, academia or company that they're working at on this very hard problem. And then we say, hey, come to DARPA and we're going to give you an even harder problem in your field of study. It's going to be the coolest thing you ever work on in your life. And they want to come do that for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then they go back. Coming in and saying, hey, I want you to come in here so you can explain to me how I can regulate this technology. Quite like have the same. Nonetheless, again, I'll quote my secretary out of Reagan, who said she's working to make BIS the most important, fun place to work in government. And I'm all in on that role. And so we're looking for smart people. I just kept pointing that out.
And I
So
think,
it's an open door recruiting thing. So we're trying to get that. And again, it doesn't have to all be internal. I want to have access to outside resources, whether through an OFF4DC or think tanks that have smart people on particular tech that we can go to. And then, so after laying out that kind of groundwork, I'll roll out the regular hits. Quantum, we already have some proposals in Bosnar related to quantum. Again, this thing, Bosnar, we're going to propose it this year. Russia's going to not vote for it. Bosnar is a consensus organization. Bosnar is going to operate under a consensus -1 capability. All right, so this year is going to go. And then next year, we'll put it before the technology in today's universe moves at quantum speeds. So yeah, we need to move a little faster.
Yeah.
I'm glad this did not come up on the 60 Minutes interview on biotech is another area, especially areas like synthetic biology, which have all sorts of upsides and downsides. The trick on areas like biotechnology is, okay, so what's my choke point that I'm really going to go after? Is it widely available, or is it really a choke point? To be a choke point, it has to be not widely available. And two, I'm not trying to impede the PRC from curing cancer. That's good for mankind, right? And sometimes those same machines can do this and do that.
right, that makes sense. So you just mentioned Bosnar. So of course, there are also other multilateral export control regimes, of course. And you also already alluded to the problem with some of the multilateral regimes, namely Russia being part of that. How do you see the future role of multilateral regimes in working with allies and export control policy?
Yeah. So first, let me start. The 4 multilateral regimes have worked well for us and for other countries. So I think it's important. I'm not trying to divest any of those. I think they're key parts of the export control world, and I stay and do their jobs. I think in certain areas, especially in the high tech areas, where we need to move at the speed of tech in order to make decisions, I do think we need a new dynamic, whether we want to call it fifth regime, a new framework, whatever you want to call it, irrelevant, but we need our allies and us to get together. Again, it has to be multilateral, has to be with us and the people who matter that are producing tech. And, we've started to have those discussions with our allies and within the interagency on how that best framework that. And there's frankly not full agreement on what's the best path for doing that in the interagency. But that's okay. I mean, that's the way the interagency works. So you pound that out here. At the same time, you're going out and building the consensus that you need to do something with the allies. And frankly, when I talk to allies on the trips that I've taken, there's acceptance that we do need to do something. How to do it is the question.
That makes sense. You've mentioned a number of times now, technology is moving so quickly and evolving so quickly, and yes, has to move kind of at the speed of how those technologies are changing. How does that impact also enforcement? What does that look like in terms of modernizing the enforcement of export controls?
Two things there, and part one doesn't affect just enforcement; it actually affects export administration and how we do assessment of rules. We need tech inside BIS. The underlying. When I got to BIS, and again, I came from consulting, but my DoD world where we never had enough money, but we had a lot of money. I said, okay, we need like someone to come in here and do an assessment. How much contract dollars do we have to spend? And the answer was 0. I said, what do you mean? The answer is 0. And I said, okay, well, I want to go out and buy like a supply chain illumination tool so I can see relationships across different who's doing what with whom. You know, I have this DPA authority as well. I do like under one of my shops under export administration also does assessments of the industrial base.
Mhm.
We do that for DoD too. They come to us because we have survey authority. You know, it takes a long time to do those things. So having a supply chain integration tool can shorten the timeline a little bit. So instead of doing a year and a half to do one, I might shorten, like eliminate 6 months of it just by knowing who's who in the zoo here. So I wanted to go out and get one of those. On the enforcement side, I wanted something like Palantir. Not trying to endorse any particular technology. There's other companies that do similar things, something like Palantir, so that I can connect dots. Now, this guy is related to this guy over here, and like, look at this company that only started here yesterday, and like, you know, so both on the open source side and on the IC side, so I can get a single picture, just like the DoD wants when in the Intel community when they do that. How much money do I have for that? Nothing.
Makes it difficult.
Makes it difficult.
Very difficult.
And then, you know, even doing some interagency agreements for people who have tools I need. So you know, again, I go back to, I need resources to do this job better. I have used end of year money and stuff like that to buy nascent capability of some of those things that I just described, but I need to build out that capability. I want to leave BIS using 21st century tools when I leave, not early 20th century tools. Hey, look at this pen. It works well on a spreadsheet. Now, with that said, you know, my enforcement team, which is awesome, you know, we're intertwined with the IC. You know, and I do have like a group that is completely intertwined with the IC. I would like to get a little more staff out into the field. I'd like to get some capability out in the field. I realize some of the things I just described. I'm buying for the headquarters. I just visited our team in LA, you know, which is like there's a lot more people in this room than on my team in LA.
Yeah, that definitely.
And they're really good people there who know what they're doing. But I want to give them tools and maybe some more shoe leather as well in order to do their jobs better.
Great. Well, we have a few minutes left, so I want to open up the conversation also to the audience here in the room for anybody who would like to ask a question. So please, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Somebody will bring you a microphone. Just introduce yourself, say your name, state your affiliation, and just also a friendly reminder to please keep your questions brief if you can, so we can get to as many as possible.
Thanks. Good afternoon. My name is Tino Giovanni. I'm at the Cohen Group. Met a couple times before. My question is about export controls and open source software. How there's been conversations on the Hill, conversations in think tank space about how to potentially control the open space software world. Maybe you could just talk about how you're approaching that and thinking about those problems. Thanks.
Yeah. So of course, there's all sorts of open source software out there. We're talking about like large language training models. We're having those discussions. I don't know what the answer is yet, but it's certainly on radar of what to do. Most of the people I talk to say it's not something I need to worry about yet, but you know, could get there maybe. Right? It depends on how the LLM world evolves. And we know, you know, it's look the explosion that we had this year of ChatGPT 4 and OpenAI and drama around that. So, you know, figuring out how to do that in such a way so we don't stifle the innovation that we derive from that, but while protecting us. Same thing on use of cloud. I have a team that's, I want to say locked in a room, but they're not. Some of them were allowed out to see the light of day. Some of them are here today. Working on what's the answer, what are our options? Let's start with what are our options. Once we hone our options, we'll start talking to industry. I want a set that we think is close, and then we'll start getting ideas from industry and get their feedback because that's important. You know, there are people who are operating know a lot space more than some of the people that we have. So it is definitely something that is an area of concern and on the radar. We'll get you
Well,
next.
yes.
Thank you so much. I'm sitting in a funny position to get my phone to charge, so thank you for bringing this over. I have a couple of questions. I just wanted to ask about the is-informed letters that targeted some, I think, D5 countries. You know, there's been a lot of speculation. Is the kind of goal there the risk of diversion to China from those countries? Is that the intent there? Another question, you mentioned working with allies. Obviously, we've seen the Dutch and the Japanese come up with parallel regimes. And I wondered, you know, which other allies in particular are you guys still looking at working with? And then a third question on the issue of you know, AI. A lot of people, I think in Congress especially, say that one of the loopholes in terms of actually preventing AI capabilities from going to China is the fact that there's no way to prevent, you know, a bad actor from renting space on, you know, AWS or another US cloud provider. Obviously, that's more of an end use issue and not an export, so it's tough for BIS to address it. But there's been talk of Congress giving you guys more authorities to do something like that. And I wondered, you know, if you supported that or if you see that as, you know, a good idea. Thank you.
Let me start with the
Alex
cloud.
Reuters.
Cloud. We're looking at what to do about cloud. I'm not sure that I need more authorities. I think I actually have authorities I need there. It's how best to get at it. And there's, you know, the question I just answered was that too on open source was we're looking at different options. We'll talk to companies when we have options honed, and we'll decide whether there's something we need. We don't talk about is-informed letters. Those are between us and companies. We did put out in the rule a requirement for licenses through certain countries that pose risk of diversion. And again, those are countries where there's pop-up companies, easy to do that kind of stuff. So we want to know who we're selling to. It's not that we don't want to sell to those countries, right? So we see it was with probability of approval. So it depends on who it's going to. And your third one was? Well, of course, the Dutch and the Japanese acted on their own to do this. We appreciate that. We would encourage some other countries that happen to do something in the tool making world or tools themselves to do likewise.
Thank you very much. I am Mathilde Vellier from the French Institute of International Relations. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little on your view on how to reconcile or balance the coalition building efforts with the use of extraterritorial tools in the rules, because we have seen, for instance, the Dutch and Japanese authorities acting on DUV machines, and also on the recent updates, expanded use of extraterritorial tools on this. Thank you very much.
So for the most part, we rarely use our extraterritorial tools without talking to the countries involved. And for the most part, reach agreement. Yeah, using in relation to Russia or countries that are adversarial, I don't go. But if I'm going to use something that's made in a country, for sure. And we'll talk about what controls they feel they can put on, what their authorities are. And sometimes they want us to manage. And I'm not going to talk about any particular instances. But these are things that we work with our allies. So, on the Russia scenario, we said, if you can control this, because we all had the same end goal, right? Do it, and then we won't impose foreign direct product rule. If you can't, we need to control it because it's going to uncontrolled help the Russians. We'll do it, and so it's an agreement across the coalition to do it that way.
Hi, so you hit a little bit on like some of the outlets to gather info on effectiveness. I was wondering if you had specific metrics that your team looks for when gauging effectiveness, short of, oh, China still doesn't have the most advanced chips, so we're doing our job.
And you are?
I'm Kelton Risky. I'm actually at PMF in your office right now.
I'm tasking you to figure out what our metrics are. Like, it's hard to judge that. It takes time to judge what the effectiveness of any particular control is. You know, because again, export controls are not a guillotine that comes slamming down, the head falls off and goes in the basket. You know, it's a slow squeeze, and especially for capability that exists in the world and that may have existed before we put the control on. So when I start talking about chips for China, they were getting advanced machines until 2022. You know, with some restrictions on a certain fab in certain places, but you know, for the most part, they have access. They had access until recently. So until those machines start breaking and they can't replace them, or the servicing on them goes down, it's going to be a slow ride to achieve the goal that we're trying to achieve there. Now, they weren't making the most advanced chips to begin with, so like we start off with an advantage from that perspective. And then it's like measuring, okay, where are they? Where are we? Have we advanced? Not just we. When I say we, I mean we and our allies.
Right, I think we're almost at time. So I wanted to maybe tee up one last question for you, or just you know, let you make let you have the last word. You've already talked about you know, needing a bigger budget. We've already you know, joked about that. But of course, there are other aspects and resources that BIS needs that you've talked about. But just curious, what kinds of resources do you need now? What do you anticipate needing in the future? And yeah, I'll leave the last word to you.
You know, this is a new BIS. The mission's harder, more complex. And why is that? It's because the threat is harder and more complex. And you know, China's been a threat for a while. That's what we did back in our DoD days. Right? We did budget over cricket, right? China, Russia, Iran, Korea, and terrorism. If it didn't fit, the first two of those wasn't going to get funded. You know, so in order to, so you got a threat that's a real threat that's changing, and you have technology that's advancing at technology speed of today. And whether, you know, we take advantage of that or not is irrelevant, because the adversary could. So we need to consider that they can. So, and it's complex and it's dual use, right? You know, the reason we stood up at DoD things like DIU is because even more importance of reaching to places like Silicon Valley for, they're not going to build the next fighter jet, but they're going to build something that's going to go into that fighter jet, or they're going to build the next drone, right? So all that plays into that. All the same thing applies to adversaries. So getting the right people with the right thought process on how I can do those rules, very complex rules, while meeting the target without going outside the target where I'm impacting companies and not meeting the strategic goal. Now we sit, when we do controls these days, we look and we say, okay, what's the outcome I want to achieve here? Is the rule I'm trying to put, is it going to achieve that outcome? Is it going to achieve partial of that outcome? Like, what? And that requires some IC, and it requires some smart people, and it requires, you know, my interagency partners help on some of that. What's the impact on American technological leadership? You know, am I impacting us negatively by doing this so that I'm actually hurting national security, not helping national security? What's the adversary going to do? Right? So I have a list of things that I could do on a whiteboard in my office. But I have it on like a little piece of paper. It's scrolled on my desk. And I bet some guy in Beijing has, a similar list of like, graphite, gallium, germanium, what's next, or other things that they could do. Right. So, and what, are we ready for that impact that they can do? Should I put the timing on this so that and if I delay, what's the, all that is the way we're thinking about these things. If they started lining up on the streets, I actually have people who go to war games at DoD now and say, like, here's the controls that we would start applying. Treasury does as well. That's new. That's new. Right? So it's a much more complex environment. It's a cool environment. Coolest place to work in government.
Selling the job.
Yeah. So, that's why we have to think about these things. So when you're putting on these blanket controls, or whether it's the targeted control, you need to be thinking through all those things. And it's complex. I have a secretary who's laser focused on BIS. I'm not sure how many secretaries of commerce have spent as much time as Gina Raimondo has spent working in the BIS mission. Or a national security advisor who sits in National Security Council meetings and starts saying, hey, can we do this in country code C? Why do you know that? Because it's a new tool. It's not a new tool in the toolbox, but it's a tool in the toolbox, but it's at least been discovered and can be effective, and we're going to make it so.
Well, that it's all obviously a very, like you said, complex and complicated job. I know you have called yourself the Chief Technology Protection Officer. So yeah, like you said, it's all very complex. So we really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us here today, Under Secretary Estevez. It was a great conversation. I, for one, really enjoyed having you here and having this insightful conversation with you. So really appreciate it. Also, a huge thank you to everybody who came today here in the room, and also, of course, online. Thank you for tuning in. Want to wish you all, of course, happy holidays, and we hope to see you at the next CSET event in 2024. Thank you.
With a ghost of Christmas future, that's going to be leading to the end we're looking for.
That's right. That's right.